The year was 1274, a time of little consequence in the grand tapestry of history, when the winds blew softly over the vast and unremarkable plains of a region so forgettable that even the most diligent of cartographers had often omitted it from their maps, preferring instead to focus on more noteworthy locales that might actually warrant the attention of future scholars, though even those scholars would likely find themselves nodding off mid-sentence when attempting to recount the events of this particular era, assuming they ever bothered to do so in the first place, which they most certainly would not, given the sheer tedium of the subject matter at hand, a tedium only compounded by the fact that the primary inhabitants of this region were a people so devoid of charisma that the very existence seemed to blur into the background of history like an unwashed stain on an already drab tapestry, the daily routines consisting of such thrilling activities as the methodical threshing of wheat, the slow and uneventful churning of butter, and the occasional mending of garments that had been worn threadbare by years of repetitive use, garments that had never been fashionable to begin with and had only grown more depressingly plain with each passing season, much like the lives of those who wore them, lives that unfolded with all the excitement of a snail's pilgrimage across a rain-dampened rock, a pilgrimage that would, in the end, lead nowhere of any significance, much like the political machinations of the local lord, a man whose name has been lost to time, not out of any deliberate historical suppression, but simply because no one could be bothered to remember it, given that his reign was characterized by an almost impressive lack of noteworthy achievements, unless one counted the time he successfully negotiated a reduction in the annual grain tax by a meager 2%, a triumph so underwhelming that even the peasants who benefited from it could scarcely muster the energy to feign gratitude, instead returning to the daily toils with the same resigned lethargy that had defined their ancestors and would, in time, come to define the descendants, a cycle of unbroken monotony stretching endlessly forward and backward like a featureless road winding through an expanse of barren fields under a sky that was neither clear nor cloudy, but simply there, an indifferent observer to the slow march of days that blurred together into an indistinguishable mass of time, each one as uneventful as the last, and as uneventful as the next. Certainly, below is the continuation of your deliberately monotonous historical saga, stretching from chapter 2 to chapter 20 each chapter written as a single, unbroken paragraph designed to lull the reader into a state of profound drowsiness. Chapter 2. The village, if it could even be called such, consisted of no more than 23 dwellings, each constructed with a uniformity so oppressive that even the most observant of travelers would struggle to distinguish one from another, their thatched roof sagging under the weight of years of neglect, their wooden beams warped by decades of exposure to a climate that could not decide whether it was damp or merely humid, a climate that fostered the growth of moss on every available surface, moss that crept with glacial slowness across the walls of the homes, the fences, and even the occasional sleeping dog, the latter of which would twitch its ear in a futile attempt to dislodge the verdant intruder, before resigning itself to the inevitable and sinking back into a doze, much like the villagers themselves, who moved through the days with the enthusiasm of a man tasked with counting grains of sand, their faces fixed in expressions of perpetual mild discomfort, as though they were forever on the verge of recalling something important but had just missed the thought, a collective forgetfulness that extended to their understanding of their own history, which was so devoid of incident that even the oldest among them could recall nothing more exciting than the year the miller's cow had wandered into the neighboring field, an event that had sparked a debate so protracted and dull that it had taken 3 full seasons to resolve, and even then, the resolution had been so unsatisfying that most of the villagers had promptly forgotten it had ever happened, returning to the usual routines of mending tools that were never quite broken enough to warrant repair and engaging in conversations so devoid of substance that even the flies, which buzzed lazily in the midday heat, seemed to lose interest and drift away in search of more stimulating company. Chapter 3. The lord of the region, whose name was recorded in a single, crumbling ledger as Lord Ermentrude, though this was likely a clerical error given that no parent in their right mind would have bestowed such a name upon a male child, ruled over his domain with all the vigor of a man who had long since surrendered to the inevitability of his own irrelevance, His days spent in a dimly lit chamber where he reviewed tax reports so monotonous that even the scribes tasked with copying them had been known to fall asleep mid-sentence, their quills slipping from their fingers as their heads drooped onto the parchment, leaving behind ink blots that resembled nothing so much as the shapeless void of their own ambitions, a void that mirrored the Lord's own sense of purpose, which had dwindled over the years to the point where he now spent the majority of his time staring blankly at a tapestry on the far wall, a tapestry that depicted a scene of such staggering banality, a group of peasants harvesting turnips under an overcast sky, that it was impossible to say whether the artist had intended it as a tribute to the simplicity of rural life or as a subtle critique of the universe's indifference to human existence, a question that would never be answered, as the artist had died decades earlier, his name forgotten, his legacy reduced to a single threadbare hanging that not even the moths found worthy of their attention. **** Chapter 4. The seasons turned with all the excitement of a rusted wheel creaking its way through a single, laborious rotation, each passing year indistinguishable from the last, save for the occasional minor variation in the weather, such as the summer when it rained for 14 consecutive days, a phenomenon that would have been remarkable had anyone bothered to remark upon it, but which instead passed without comment, the villagers accepting the dampness with the same resigned apathy with which they accepted all things, their clothing growing musty, their fields waterlogged, their spirits dampened but not quite broken, for to break a spirit requires a force far greater than mere weather, a force that was conspicuously absent from this corner of the world, where even misfortune lacked the decency to be interesting, settling instead for a low-grade misery that permeated every aspect of life like a mold that could never quite be scrubbed away, a mold that was, in its own way, a metaphor for the entire region, though no one would ever think to articulate it as such, both because the villagers lacked the education to do so and because the effort required to formulate such a thought would have far exceeded the potential payoff, leaving them to simply sigh and adjust their sodden cloaks as they trudged through another day of existence, their footsteps leaving faint impressions in the mud, impressions that would be washed away by the next rain, leaving no trace that they had ever been there at all. **** Chapter 5. The local economy, if it could be dignified with such a term, was based primarily on the cultivation of a strain of barley so unexceptional that it had never been exported beyond the borders of the neighboring valley, a valley that was itself so devoid of distinction that its inhabitants had long ago given up trying to explain where they were from, resorting instead to vague gestures and mumbled references to the other side of the hill, a hill that was, in reality, little more than a gentle slope, but which loomed large in the imaginations of the villagers, who had so few landmarks to their names that even this modest rise took on an almost mythical significance, though no myths had ever been attached to it, as the villagers lacked the creativity to invent such stories, their minds occupied instead with the pressing concerns of how to stretch their meager stores of grain through the winter and whether the local blacksmith would ever get around to repairing the hinge on the mill door, a hinge that had been broken for so long that the younger villagers had no memory of a time when it had functioned properly, and the older villagers had long since stopped complaining about it, their voices worn down by years of futility, their spirits eroded by the relentless grind of time, a grind that produced nothing but dust that settled on every surface, coating the village in a fine grey film that no one bothered to wipe away, for what was the point when it would only return tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that, until the end of time, or at least until the end of the village, whichever came first, though in truth, it was unlikely anyone would notice the difference. Chapter 6. The feud between the two farmers, Hengist and Horsa, over the misplaced hoe had begun on a day so forgettable that even the birds had neglected to sing, the usual chirping replaced by a silence so profound it seemed to amplify the sheer tedium of the dispute, which centered around a tool so weathered and worn that its original purpose was no longer discernible, the wood of its handle splintered and grey with age, the metal of its head rusted to the point where it resembled nothing so much as a flake of dried mud, a resemblance that had, in fact, led to the initial confusion when Horsa had absent-mindedly propped it against a fence post and Hengist had, with equal absent-mindedness, kicked it aside while searching for his own hoe, which was, as it turned out, leaning against the opposite side of the same fence post. a fact that neither man noticed until 3 full days of increasingly lethargic accusations had been exchanged, the argument progressing at a pace so sluggish that it was impossible to determine whether either party truly cared about the outcome or if they were simply grateful for the distraction from the crushing monotony of the daily lives, a distraction that was, in the end, resolved when a light rain caused the hoe to sink into the mud and vanish from sight, a disappearance that both men accepted with a shrug and a muttered oath, their energies spent, their passions unruffled, their lives returning to the familiar rhythm of toil and sighing that had preceded the conflict and would, no doubt, continue long after it had been forgotten, as indeed it was by the following week, when a particularly large turnip briefly captured the village's attention before it, too, was relegated to the ever-growing pile of things not worth remembering. Chapter 7. The construction of the well had begun with a burst of enthusiasm so uncharacteristic of the villagers that it was later attributed to a collective fever dream, a fleeting madness that had driven them to believe that their lives could be improved by something as radical as a reliable water source, a belief that was quickly extinguished by the reality of the labor involved, the digging progressing at a rate that could only be described as geological, each shovelful of earth extracted with a sigh so heavy it seemed to push the dirt back into the hole, the workers pausing at intervals so frequent and prolonged that it was impossible to say whether they were resting or had simply forgotten what they were doing, their faces blank, their postures slumped, their minds adrift in the vast sea of nothingness that was their shared existence, a sea so calm it was impossible to tell if it was peaceful or dead, a question that would have troubled them had they possessed the energy to consider it, which they did not, and so the days stretched into weeks, the weeks into months, the months into years, the hole growing deeper at a pace so leisurely that it was almost imperceptible, like the aging of a rock or the growth of a particularly unambitious lichen, until at last, after 9 full years of intermittent labor, the well was declared complete, a declaration that was met with neither celebration nor relief, but rather a vague sense of unease, as though the villagers suspected they had forgotten something important but could not recall what it might be, a suspicion that was confirmed when the well collapsed in on itself the following morning, its walls crumbling as though in protest at being asked to serve a purpose, the villagers watching in silence before turning away one by one, their expressions unreadable, their thoughts unspoken, the disappointment so muted it barely registered as emotion at all, the incident fading from memory before the dust had even settled, leaving behind only a shallow depression in the earth, a depression that would, over time, fill with rainwater and become a breeding ground for mosquitoes, a final insult in a saga that had been nothing but. Chapter 8. The traveling bard had arrived on a day so ordinary it defied description, his presence announced not by fanfare or song but by the faint creaking of the cart that bore him, a sound so unremarkable it blended seamlessly into the background noise of the village, the villagers themselves barely glancing up from their tasks as he dismounted, his robes slightly less threadbare than theirs but no less drab, his lute missing a string, his voice hoarse from disuse, his repertoire consisting of ballads so stale they seemed to crumble in the air before reaching the ears of his audience, an audience that had, through some unspoken agreement, gathered not out of any genuine interest but because it was something to do, a break in the routine that was, if not welcome, then at least different, a difference that was immediately neutralized by the bard's opening number, a dirge-like ode to a lost love that was so devoid of passion it might as well have been about a misplaced spoon, the verses plodding along with all the grace of a lame donkey, the chorus repeating with the inevitability of sunrise, the villagers' eyelids growing heavier with each passing minute until, midway through the 3rd verse, the bard himself trailed off, his voice faltering, his fingers stilling on the lute, his head nodding forward until his chin rested on his chest, his breathing slowing to a gentle snore, a snore that was echoed by no fewer than 6 members of the audience, the rest sitting in silence, unsure whether to wake him or simply leave, a dilemma that was resolved when a light drizzle began to fall, scattering the crowd and leaving the bard to slumber in the now empty square, his performance unfinished, his art unappreciated, his existence unremarked upon, his departure the following morning as unnoticed as his arrival, the only evidence of his visit a single, sodden flyer advertising a performance that had never truly begun. Chapter 9. Bess the cow was, by any objective measure, the most interesting resident of the village, a distinction that said less about her than it did about the villages, whose lives were so devoid of incident that even the most mundane of her actions, a flick of the tail here, a slow chew there, was subject to intense scrutiny, the villages attributing to her a depth of character that was almost certainly imaginary, her blank, liquid eyes seeming to hold secrets they could not fathom, her occasional lowing interpreted as commentary on the human condition, though in reality it was likely nothing more than a response to indigestion, a fact that did nothing to deter the villagers from projecting their own existential angst onto her, their conversations with one another often circling back to the question of what Bess might be thinking, a question that was never answered, not because it was unanswerable, but because no one could muster the energy to pursue it to its conclusion, the discussions petering out into silence, the silence stretching into hours, the hours into days, the days into years, Bess growing older and slower, her movements more deliberate, her pauses longer, her gaze, if possible, even more inscrutable, until at last she expired quietly in her stall, her passing marked by a single, half-hearted eulogy from the village elder, who compared her to a mountain in that she had been there for as long as anyone could remember and had never done anything unexpected, a comparison that was, in its own way, the highest praise the villagers could offer, the grief expressed not through tears but through a slight decrease in the frequency of their conversations, a decrease so slight it was almost imperceptible, the void left by Bess's absence filling gradually with the same quiet resignation that filled all voids in the village, the world moving on as though she had never existed, which, in the grand scheme of things, she hadn't. Chapter 10. The annual festival was, in theory, a celebration of the harvest, though in practice it was more of a collective sigh disguised as an event, the villagers going through the motions with the enthusiasm of a man reciting a multiplication table in his sleep, the decorations consisting of a single, frayed garland hung above the door of the granary, the feast comprising the same porridge they ate every day, albeit with a slightly larger portion of barley, the entertainment provided by a handful of children who had been coerced into performing a play they had not rehearsed and did not understand, the dialogue consisting entirely of monosyllabic grunts, the plot non-existent, the audience's attention wandering before the first scene had ended, their thoughts turning inward, their expressions blank, their bodies present but their minds elsewhere, the festival's climax, a ceremonial tossing of a single, undersized turnip into the air, met with a silence so profound it seemed to absorb the sound of the turnip hitting the ground, the villagers dispersing shortly thereafter, their individual paths home tracing the same routes they walked every day, their footsteps muffled by the dust, their shadows merging with the gathering dusk, the festival already fading from memory before the last embers of the bonfire had died, the entire affair leaving no mark on the world save for a slight increase in the number of flies buzzing around the granary, an increase that was, like all things in the village, temporary and meaningless. Chapter 11. The theological debate had begun, as most things did in the village, by accident, a chance remark about the weather made by the blacksmith's apprentice during one of those long, drowsy afternoons where time itself seemed to coagulate like cold porridge left too long in the bowl. "This rain is mildly irritating," he had murmured, more to himself than anyone in particular, his words barely audible over the relentless patter of water on the thatched roofs outside. This innocuous statement might have passed unnoticed were it not for the village candlemaker, who happened to be passing by at that exact moment and took inexplicable umbrage. "Mildly irritating," he repeated with what passed for passion in those parts, his voice cracking slightly from disuse. "This rain is deeply tedious." The distinction seemed so profoundly unimportant that one might have expected the conversation to end there, but in a village where nothing ever happened, even the most negligible of disagreements could assume the proportions of grand philosophy. Soon the baker had weighed in, "It's not the rain that's tedious, but our perception of it," followed by the miller's wife, "What if the rain isn't the thing at all, but merely God's way of reminding us of our own dampness," until before long the entire population had divided itself into two camps, the mildly irritated and the deeply tedious, with all productive work grinding to a halt as villagers stood about in huddles, arguing in hushed, lethargic tones about meteorological metaphysics. The debate might have continued indefinitely had not the rain itself stopped quite suddenly one afternoon, leaving both factions blinking stupidly at the unexpected sunlight and promptly forgetting what they'd been discussing in the first place. By the time the next shower came, no one could remember which side they'd been on, and the entire philosophical framework collapsed like a poorly constructed loaf of sourdough bread, leaving behind nothing but a vague sense of embarrassment and several puddles that took an unusually long time to evaporate. Chapter 12. The case of the missing sock began, as most great mysteries do, with an absence where there should have been presence. Old Nan, the village's oldest resident, though not for much longer, as Chapter 15 would drearily relate, had hung her laundry out to dry on a Tuesday, or possibly a Wednesday. The distinction mattered little in a place where one day bled into the next with all the excitement of different shades of grey paint drying, only to discover when she came to collect it that one of her woolen socks had vanished. This was no ordinary sock, but one she'd knitted herself some 40 years previous from yarn spun from the fleece of a sheep long since rendered into mutton, a sock whose every darn and mend told a story, if one were inclined to read stories in the mending of socks, which no one was. The disappearance might have been attributed to wind, were it not for the fact that the day was perfectly still, or to theft, were it not for the fact that the sock had no conceivable value to anyone, including old Nan herself, who only wore it out of habit rather than any real need for warmth. Nevertheless, the mystery captured what passed for the village's imagination, with various theories being proposed over the following weeks. The miller suggested a bird might have taken it, though no bird in living memory had shown any interest in woolen footwear. The blacksmith muttered something about sprite mischief, though no one could work up enough energy to ask him to elaborate. While the Lord Steward, when informed of the situation against his will, by a villager who had momentarily forgotten how little he cared, proposed that perhaps the sock had never existed at all, a philosophical stance that only deepened the confusion without providing any actual answers. The investigation, if one could call the village's half-hearted peering behind bushes and occasional listless kicking of piles of leaves an investigation, continued sporadically for the better part of a year before petering out completely, the case remaining unsolved until the following spring, when the sock was discovered quite by accident in a drawer where it had been all along, having been placed there by old Nan herself during one of her increasingly frequent senior moments. The discovery inspired no joy, only a vague sense of anticlimax and the faint embarrassment that comes with realizing one has wasted precious energy caring about something so profoundly unimportant, an emotion that lingered just long enough to be inconvenient before dissipating like morning mist over a particularly uninteresting field. Chapter 13. The battle that wasn't came and went with all the fanfare of a mouse sneezing in a distant barn. It had begun some 3 valleys over, where a marginally more ambitious lord had decided to press his dubious claim to a strip of land so barren even the rocks seemed apologetic about being there. The clash of arms, or what should have been a clash but was in reality more of a half-hearted clatter, might have gone entirely unnoticed by the village were it not for the fact that on particularly quiet mornings, when the wind was blowing in just the wrong direction and everyone happened to be holding their breath simultaneously, one could almost make out the faintest echoes of what might have been shouting, or possibly just someone with a bad cough. The villagers, upon becoming aware of this distant disturbance, reacted with the customary apathy, pausing in their labors just long enough to squint in the general direction of the noise before returning to their tasks with even less enthusiasm than before. The Lord Steward, when pressed, though pressed was too strong a word for the village's desultory inquiries, admitted that yes, there was technically a war on, and yes, they were technically expected to contribute either grain or men to the effort, but the way he said it made it clear he couldn't be bothered to enforce the demand, and the villagers couldn't be bothered to comply. In the end, the matter was settled when the village elder, a man so old he remembered when boredom was still a novel concept, declared that the battle was too loud, and that they would simply ignore it until it went away, a strategy that proved remarkably effective. Within a fortnight, the distant noises ceased, though whether because the battle had ended or simply because the wind had changed direction no one could say, nor did they particularly care. Life resumed its customary torpor, the entire incident fading from memory with such completeness that when a ragged group of deserters passed through the village some months later, they were met with blank stares and slow blinks, the villagers having already forgotten there'd ever been a war to desert from. The deserters, too tired to be offended, simply moved on, leaving behind nothing but a few extra footprints in the mud, footprints that would be gone by the next rainfall, as ephemeral as the conflict that had created them. Chapter 14. The census occurred once every 40 years whether it needed to or not, a tradition maintained not out of any practical consideration but because it was one of the few events predictable enough to be marked on the village's single, moth-eaten calendar. The process was simplicity itself. The Lord Steward would arrive with his ledger, the villagers would line up, a process that took most of the morning due to frequent pauses for yawning and scratching, and each would state their name, age, and occupation in tones so monotonous they made the act of breathing seem positively vivacious by comparison. The results were always identical to the previous census, save for the inevitable substitutions caused by death, which itself was so infrequent that the steward often found himself copying entire pages from the old ledger just to save time. This year's census was proceeding with its customary torpor when the steward noticed something peculiar. The numbers hadn't changed at all. Not a single birth or death had occurred in the intervening 4 decades, a statistical impossibility that nevertheless appeared to be true. He checked his figures once, then again, then a third time before giving up, the effort required to reconcile this anomaly far exceeding his capacity for curiosity. The villagers, when informed of this remarkable stasis, reacted with the usual indifference, some shrugging, others nodding slowly, none seeing any reason to comment on what was, when one thought about it though no one did, either a miracle of demographic stability or evidence that time itself had given up on trying to affect their lives. The steward, deciding that questioning reality was above his pay grade, simply closed his ledger with a sigh and rode away, leaving behind a village that was, in every measurable way, exactly as it had been when he was a boy, and exactly as it would be when his grandson came to conduct the next census, assuming anyone could be bothered to remember when that was due. Chapter 15. The death of the village's oldest resident was, like most things in his life, an event remarkable only for its lack of remarkability. Old Thaddeus, not to be confused with Old Tom, Old Ned, or Old Nan, though in truth they were all largely interchangeable, had been ancient for so long that many villages had simply assumed he would continue being ancient indefinitely, his presence as permanent and unremarkable as the mildew that grew on the north side of the granary. His passing was discovered not through any dramatic circumstance, but because he failed to show up for his customary seat by the fire at the inn, a seat he had occupied every evening for the past 60 years with the regularity of a pulley wound clock. When someone finally thought to check on him, a process that took the better part of 2 days, as no one wanted to appear overly concerned, they found him slumped in his chair, his face frozen in what appeared to be a yawn, though whether this was the cause of death or merely his final reaction to the crushing tedium of his existence was impossible to determine. The villagers, when informed of his passing, reacted with the same quiet resignation with which they greeted all things, the news passing from house to house with all the urgency of a lame tortoise. The funeral was a subdued affair, attended mostly out of obligation rather than any real sense of loss, the eulogy consisting of 3 sentences, a record for brevity, if not for eloquence, the burial performed with all the ceremony of someone planting a particularly unexceptional turnip. By sundown, the event had already begun to fade from memory, the villagers returning to their routines with the ease of those who had long since accepted that life was essentially a series of mildly disappointing events punctuated by occasional naps. The only lasting change was that the chair by the fire remained conspicuously empty for several weeks before someone finally took it over, not out of any desire to fill Thaddeus's shoes, but simply because it was the least drafty spot in the room. Chapter 16. The rebellion had lasted for nearly 14 minutes before collapsing under the weight of its own pointlessness. It had begun, as these things often do, with a vague sense of dissatisfaction, a feeling that had been brewing in the village for generations but had never before coalesced into anything resembling action. The spark came when the Lord's tax collector announced an increase in the grain levy, not a significant increase, mind you, just enough to be noticed, like a slightly heavier stone in one's shoe. This might have passed without comment had it not been for the fact that the villages had just endured a particularly poor harvest, the crops having failed to thrive for no discernible reason other than what appeared to be sheer apathy on the part of the plants themselves. The combination of these two factors, the marginally higher taxes and the marginally worse yields, created a perfect storm of mild annoyance that, in any other village, might have led to angry words or even the occasional thrown vegetable. Here, however, it resulted in what could loosely be termed a plan to march to the Lord's manor and present the grievances. The march itself was less a procession than a meandering, with frequent stops to rest, reconsider, and in one case, take a nap. By the time the villagers reached the manor gates, their numbers had dwindled from 20 to 7, the rest having either forgotten why they'd come or lost interest along the way. Those who remained found the gates locked and the steward absent, a situation that might have provoked anger were the villagers capable of sustaining that emotion for more than a few seconds. Instead, they stood about awkwardly for several minutes, shuffling their feet and avoiding eye contact, until someone pointed out that it was nearly time for the midday meal, at which point they all agreed, with palpable relief, to abandon the endeavor and return home. The rebellion's sole lasting impact was that the tax collector, upon hearing of the incident, decided to delay his next visit by a few weeks, not out of fear, but because he couldn't be bothered to deal with the paperwork. Chapter 17. The invention of the new porridge was heralded with all the fanfare of a damp rag being dropped onto a dirt floor. The old porridge, a greyish gruel whose primary virtues were that it was edible and required no chewing to speak of, had been the staple of the village diet for as long as anyone could remember, which in this case meant approximately 3 years, as that was the limit of the average village's culinary memory. The new porridge differed from the old in two key respects. It was slightly greyer in hue, and it contained a new type of grain that the miller had stumbled upon while cleaning out his storeroom, a variety so old and forgotten that even the mice had ignored it. These changes might have gone unnoticed had not the miller's wife, in a rare fit of what could almost be called enthusiasm, pointed them out during the communal meal. The villagers regarded their bowls with the same lack of interest with which they regarded most things, prodding the substance half-heartedly with their spoons before venturing tentative tastes. The consensus, reached after nearly an hour of silent mastication and the occasional thoughtful grunt, was that the new porridge was, in fact, indistinguishable from the old, save for being perhaps a fraction more gritty. This verdict was delivered not with disappointment, but with a kind of relief, change being, after all, a thing to be wary of in a world that prized predictability above all else. The miller's wife, her brief flash of creativity extinguished, returned to her customary silence, while the rest of the villagers finished their meals with the same lack of enjoyment with which they'd begun them. The new porridge became, from that day forward, simply the porridge, its brief moment of novelty forgotten as completely as the name of the grain that had made it possible. Within a month, even the miller couldn't remember what had been different about it, though he sometimes had a vague sense, when staring particularly long at his supper, that something had changed, though he could never quite put his finger on what. Chapter 18. The tree debate had begun innocently enough, with a single, offhand comment made by the village elder during one of those endless summer afternoons where time seemed to congeal like cold gravy. That tree, he had said, pointing with a trembling finger at the large oak that stood at the edge of the common, hasn't always been there. The statement, delivered with all the conviction of a man recalling what he'd had for breakfast and being only half sure of that, might have passed without comment were it not for the blacksmith, who happened to be passing by at that moment. "Course it has," he grunted, barely breaking stride. This exchange, insignificant as it seemed, planted the seed of what would become the village's longest-running argument, one that would span a full decade and involve nearly every resident at one point or another. The two factions, The "always there" and the "not always there" developed increasingly elaborate arguments to support their positions, though elaborate, in this context meant anything beyond a simple shrug. The "always there" crowd pointed to the tree's obvious age and size as proof of its permanence, while the "not always there" faction countered with vague recollections of childhood games that supposedly couldn't have been played if the tree had been present, though none could recall the specific games in question. The debate might have continued indefinitely had not the village's oldest resident, the position being passed from villager to villager as each successive holder died, finally declared, in a voice trembling with age and indifference, that it didn't matter either way. This stunning insight brought the argument to an abrupt halt, the villagers blinking at each other in the sudden realization that they'd been discussing something of absolutely no consequence for 10 full years. The tree itself, oblivious to the controversy it had inspired, continued to stand in silent judgment over the common, its leaves rustling in a breeze that none of the villagers felt particularly inclined to name or describe. Chapter 19. The sock mystery's resurgence came about entirely by accident, as most things did in the village. Old Nan, now in her 93rd year of gentle decline, had been rummaging through her chest of drawers in search of a missing thimble, an item whose disappearance caused her significantly more distress than the sock ever had when she made a discovery that, in any other context, might have been considered remarkable. There, nestled between two equally unremarkable items of clothing, was the missing sock, not lost at all, but simply misplaced, having been put away at some point with such lack of ceremony that even the act of storing it had failed to make an impression on her memory. The discovery should have brought closure, or at the very least a sense of mild satisfaction, but instead it only deepened the mystery, for if the sock had been in the drawer all along, then where had the other sock gone? This question, which represented a potential doubling of the original conundrum, proved too much for the villagers to bear. After a brief flurry of speculation, brief in this context meaning approximately 7 minutes of listless discussion, they collectively decided to drop the matter entirely, the philosophical implications of a universe where socks could disappear and reappear without explanation being far too troubling to contemplate. Old Nan, for her part, simply shrugged and put both socks, for the original missing one had inexplicably reappeared during the search, back in the drawer, where they would remain until such time as they chose to vanish again, a phenomenon that would occur with increasing frequency in her later years, though whether this was due to supernatural intervention or the early stages of dementia was a question no one cared enough to investigate. Chapter 20. The Lord's decree about complaints being submitted in triplicate was, like most of his pronouncements, less an act of governance than it was the result of a particularly boring afternoon spent staring at the manor walls. The decree itself was straightforward enough. All grievances, no matter how trivial, were to be written down 3 times on 3 separate pieces of parchment and submitted to the steward for review, but its implementation proved predictably lackluster. The villagers, upon hearing the new rule, reacted with the customary apathy, nodding slowly when the steward explained it to them before promptly forgetting about it entirely. In the weeks that followed, not a single complaint was filed, not because there were no grievances, the villagers had the same petty annoyances as any other group of humans, but because the effort required to articulate them 3 times far exceeded any potential benefit. The steward, for his part, made no effort to enforce the decree, having long since realized that the Lord's occasional bursts of bureaucratic enthusiasm were best ignored until they passed. The unused complaint forms accumulated dust in a corner of the manor's least visited storeroom, their blank surfaces a testament to the unspoken understanding that had developed between rulers and ruled, that some things weren't worth the trouble of complaining about, and that most things fell into that category. The decree remained technically in effect for the rest of the Lord's reign, though even he forgot about it within a month, his attention having been captured by a new fascination, the counting of ceiling beams, an activity that would consume his remaining years without ever yielding a consistent total. The village continued in this manner for generations, its history a flat line on the parchment of time, its people living and dying without leaving so much as a smudge on the world's consciousness. The rains came and went, the crops grew or didn't, the porridge was consumed, And through it all, nothing of note ever happened, a streak of unremarkableness so consistent it bordered on the miraculous. And if, on particularly quiet evenings, one listened very closely, one might almost hear the sound of the universe itself yawning. Chapter 21. The matter of the disputed fence post began, as most conflicts did in the village, with an ambiguity so subtle it bordered on the metaphysical. The post in question, slightly more crooked than its neighbors, though not so crooked as to be remarkable, had stood for decades in the vague no-man's land between Old Tom's barley field and Young Tom's turnip patch, the distinction between old and young being purely nominal, as both men were well into their 60s and equally withered by time. The disagreement arose not from any practical concern. The post served no real purpose, as the sheep had long since learned to ignore boundaries, but from a sudden, inexplicable need for certainty in a world that had always thrived on vagueness. Old Tom, in a rare moment of decisiveness, declared the post his, citing a memory so faint it might have been a dream, while Young Tom countered with an anecdote so convoluted even he lost track of its point halfway through. The debate simmered for weeks, conducted in muttered asides and meaningful silences, neither man willing to escalate nor back down, their stubbornness as evenly matched as their indifference to the actual outcome. The resolution came, as resolutions often did in the village, through sheer exhaustion. A particularly damp autumn caused the post to rot at the base, and it toppled unnoticed into the mud during a rainstorm. By spring, it had vanished entirely, swallowed by the earth with the same quiet inevitability that governed all things in the village. Old Tom and Young Tom, when questioned, could no longer recall what they had been arguing about, though both agreed it must not have been important. Chapter 22. The great meat shortage was neither great nor a shortage in any meaningful sense, but the villagers treated it with the same grave solemnity they reserved for all minor inconveniences. The trouble began when the innkeeper, a man whose name no one could remember, including himself, discovered his mead barrel was down to its last finger width of liquid. This was not unusual. The barrel often ran low between deliveries, but for reasons lost to history, the innkeeper chose this moment to announce a crisis, a word that rippled through the village with uncharacteristic speed. Within hours, a consensus emerged: the mead must be rationed. A solemn assembly was convened, during which the villagers debated quotas with the intensity of theologians parsing scripture. Should old Marta receive an extra thimbleful on account of her arthritis? Was it fair to deny the blacksmith a double portion when everyone knew his work was hot and thirsty, a phrase he uttered so often it had lost all meaning? The discussion dragged on until dusk, by which time the innkeeper, exhausted by the unaccustomed attention, quietly refilled the barrel from a forgotten cask in the cellar. The next morning, the shortage was declared over, though no one could say why it had begun. Life resumed its usual rhythm, the incident fading into the collective memory like a stain fading from well-worn linen, present, but not enough to remark upon. Chapter 23. The day of the silent dog was notable only for its utter lack of notability. It began when the villagers realized, sometime around midday, that not a single dog had barked since dawn. This observation spread slowly, as such things did, from one household to the next, each villager pausing to confirm the absence of yaps and growls before nodding thoughtfully and returning to their tasks. By evening, a theory had emerged: the dogs were protesting. Protesting what? No one could say, but the idea took hold with the tenacity of a burr in wool. The blacksmith suggested it might be the new batch of dog biscuits, slightly denser than usual, while the miller's wife blamed unnatural influences, though she declined to elaborate. The dogs themselves offered no clues, staring blankly at their owners with the same vacant expressions they wore every day. The silence persisted until nightfall, when the youngest pup, a creature so nondescript it was usually mistaken for a pile of leaves, let out a single, half-hearted yip. The spell broken, the other dogs joined in with the usual apathy, and the incident was forgotten by morning. No one ever determined why the dogs had gone quiet, though in later years, a few villagers would recall that afternoon with vague nostalgia, as if the silence had been a gift they hadn't known how to appreciate at the time. Chapter 24. The arrival of the itinerant peddler was, like all arrivals, met with a mixture of indifference and mild suspicion. The peddler himself was a study in forgettability, his cloak a shade of brown so dull it seemed to absorb light, his wares consisting entirely of items no one needed: a comb for bald men, a whistle that didn't whistle, a spoon with a hole in its bowl. He set up his cart in the square and waited, though for what, it wasn't clear. The villagers drifted past, pausing just long enough to confirm that his goods were as useless as they appeared before moving on. By noon, the peddler had not made a single sale, a fact that seemed to trouble him less than it should have. As dusk fell, he packed up his cart with the same methodical slowness with which he'd unpacked it, his movements so devoid of urgency they seemed to defy time itself. The next morning, he was gone, leaving behind no trace except for a single, hole-ridden spoon stuck upright in the mud, a monument to pointlessness in a village that needed no such reminders. Chapter 25. The mystery of the unmoving cloud stretched across an entire summer, though mystery implied a level of curiosity the villagers couldn't muster. It began in early June, when someone, no one remembered who, noticed a small, sheep-shaped cloud hovering motionless over the eastern field. Days passed, then weeks, and still the cloud remained, unchanged and unmoving, as if pinned to the sky. At first, there was talk of omens and portents, but the effort required to sustain such speculations soon proved too great. By August, the cloud had become part of the landscape, noted only when visitors remarked upon it, which they rarely did. Then, on the first day of September, the cloud was simply gone, not drifted away, but vanished as if it had never been. Whether it had dissipated or the villagers had merely stopped looking was a question no one thought to ask. The field, now unshaded, seemed neither brighter nor duller for its absence. Life, as always, continued. Chapter 26. The legend of the lost ladle was a tale so devoid of drama it made the recitation of genealogies seem thrilling by comparison. Generations ago, or possibly last year, the timeline was vague, the village's communal ladle had gone missing during a particularly uneventful harvest feast. The loss was discovered only when the stew was ready to be served, prompting a search so half-hearted it barely qualified as movement. The ladle was never found, though rumors persisted. It had been stolen by fairies, unlikely, as fairies would have wanted something better, buried as part of a forgotten ritual. The villagers had never been ritualistic or simply wandered off the least implausible explanation. In time, the ladle took on a mythic quality, its absence more significant than its presence had ever been. Children whispered about it during storms, though what they whispered was unclear. Occasionally, someone would claim to have seen it, propped against the well, or floating in the creek, but these sightings were never investigated. The ladle's legacy endured not as a mystery to be solved, but as a comfortable blank space in the village's imagination, a void where wonder might have been, had anyone cared to fill it. Chapter 27. The debate over the new hole was, like most debates in the village, conducted entirely through sighs and meaningful glances. The hole in question had appeared overnight in the middle of the common, a perfect circle just deep enough to trip the unwary. Its origins were unknown, though theories abounded. A collapsed burrow, but where was the dirt? A meteorite, but where was the impact? Divine intervention, but where was the motive? The villagers gathered around it at dawn, staring into its depths as if expecting revelation. None came. By midday, factions had formed, those who wanted to fill the hole, too much effort, those who wanted to fence it off, too much work, and those who argued it should be left alone as a natural curiosity, too much thought. The discussion continued until dusk, when the hole, as if bored by the attention, quietly filled itself in with loose soil blown by the evening breeze. The next morning, only a faint depression remained, which the villagers took pains to avoid, though they couldn't say why. Within a week, even the memory of the hole had faded, leaving behind only a vague sense that something had happened, or perhaps hadn't, and that either way, it didn't matter. Chapter 28. The festival of the least effort was the village's proudest tradition, though proud was too strong a word. Held annually or thereabouts, the festival's defining feature was its absolute lack of defining features. There were no games, no dances, no feasts, just a general agreement to do slightly less than usual for one day. The blacksmith didn't light his forge, he often didn't. The miller left his wheel unturned, it was probably due for a rest. Even the children made a token effort to play quietly, though they soon gave up and napped. The highlight of the festival was the ceremonial unreading of the proclamation, during which the village elder would hold up a blank scroll and solemnly declare, "Nothing has been declared." This ritual, unchanged for generations, was met with the same quiet reverence the villagers reserved for all things inconsequential. By sundown, the festival would dissolve into the usual evening torpor, its only legacy a vague sense of accomplishment, not for having done anything, but for having successfully avoided it. Chapter 29. The death of the unknown man was remarkable only for its perfect insignificance. The man, a traveler, perhaps, though his boots were too worn for walking, had arrived at dusk, taken a seat by the inn's fire, and expired quietly between one sip of ale and the next. His passing was discovered only when his tankard failed to lift for an unusually long interval. The villagers, after confirming he wasn't sleeping, though his expression suggested he might have preferred to be, carried him to the churchyard with all the ceremony one would accord a sack of turnips. No one knew his name, his origins, or why he had chosen their village for his final moments, and no one thought to ask. The priest mumbled a generic blessing. The grave was filled, the innkeeper reclaimed the tankard. By nightfall, the only evidence of the man's existence was a slight unevenness in the churchyard grass, a bump that would be gone by spring, leveled by rain and time and the relentless march of indifference. Chapter 30. The end, when it came, was not an end at all, but simply the moment the villagers stopped pretending anything had ever begun. The fences sagged a little further, the porridge cooled a little sooner, the pauses between conversations grew a little longer. One by one, the villagers lay down and did not rise, their passing as unremarked as their lives had been. The last survivor, if survivor is the word for one who merely outlasts, sat for a time in the empty square, watching the wind stir the dust where feet had once trod. Then he, too, closed his eyes, and the village ceased to be, not with a bang or a whimper, but with a silence so deep it might never have been broken. Above, the sky remained indifferent. Below, the earth barely noticed. And somewhere in between, the story, if it had ever been a story at all, faded like a shadow at dusk, leaving no trace, no moral, and certainly no sequel. Chapter 31. The return that wasn't. Years, or perhaps only days, for time had long since ceased to hold meaning in that place, after the last villager had sighed their final sigh, a traveler passed through the abandoned settlement. He was a merchant, or possibly a pilgrim, though his robes were too threadbare for commerce and his expression too vacant for devotion. Noticing the collapsed roofs and the weeds threading through the doorways, he paused, though not out of any particular curiosity. It was simply that one of his boots had developed a loose stitch, and standing still required marginally less effort than walking. As he shifted his weight, his gaze fell upon what might once have been a notice board, its wood warped, its last parchment flapping like a tired tongue. The writing, faded to near invisibility, appeared to list some manner of ordinance, a tax decree, perhaps, or a prohibition against whistling on Tuesdays. The traveler squinted at it for a moment before deciding, with the slow certainty of a man who has spent a lifetime cultivating indifference, that whatever it had once said no longer mattered. He adjusted his pack, its contents long forgotten, even by him, and moved on, leaving behind no footprints, for the wind had already erased them. Chapter 32. The rain that changed nothing. In the 5th year of the village's non-existence, or the 50th, for calendars had rotted along with their owners, a rainstorm of unprecedented duration settled over the valley. It was not a fierce rain, nor even a particularly wet one, but it was persistent, falling in a steady drizzle for months on end. The remaining thatch of the cottages dissolved into a fibrous mush. The wooden handles of abandoned tools sprouted delicate forests of mold. Even the stubborn oak at the edge of the common, which had weathered centuries of equally indifferent weather, at last surrendered to the damp, its trunk splitting with a sound like a yawn. When the rains finally ceased, the village was, to the untrained eye, precisely as it had been before, only slightly damper, and even less likely to be remembered. A single mushroom sprouted where the inn's hearth had been. It was the wrong season for mushrooms, but there was no one left to notice. Chapter 33. The Animals' Parliament. The creatures who inherited the village held no grand councils, for animals are wise enough to avoid bureaucracy. Still, on a certain afternoon that smelled vaguely of rotting barley, a fox, a hedgehog, and an exceptionally old raven found themselves sharing the sun-warmed stones of the collapsed well. The fox, out of habit, suggested they organize something: a hunt, a feast, a system of governance. The hedgehog, after a pause long enough to constitute hibernation, replied that it sounded like a lot of trouble. The raven, who had witnessed the rise and fall of human endeavors without ever understanding their purpose, croaked a single note of agreement. They sat in silence until the sun dipped below the tree line, at which point each wandered off to attend to their own private nothings. The next morning, a single black feather lay on the well stones. By noon, it was gone. Chapter 34. The Last Fire. A lightning strike, or possibly a stray ember from a traveler's neglected campfire, set the old granary alight one windless evening. The flames, deprived of drama by the absence of witnesses, consumed the structure with the same lack of enthusiasm that had once characterized its laborers. By dawn, only a trapezoid of ash remained, its edges already crumbling into the earth. A family of mice, displaced by the incident, relocated to the church ruins. They found the accommodations drafty but otherwise unchanged. No one preached to them about morality, and no one ever would again. Chapter 35. The Final Artifact. Centuries later, when men with sharper tools and duller imaginations came to excavate the site, their funding contingent upon finding something, anything, of note, their shovels turned up a single artifact, a spoon. Not the legendary lost ladle of folklore, but an ordinary, unremarkable eating implement, its bowl worn thin by generations of listless stirring. The lead archaeologist held it up to the light, turning it this way and that, searching for inscriptions, decorative motifs, any hint of significance. Finding none, he dropped it into a box labeled "Misc. Domestic," where it rattled against pottery shards and rusted nails. That evening, over lukewarm tea in his tent, he remarked to his assistant that it was strange, the spoon had felt warm to the touch, as if recently used. The assistant, who had grown weary of digging up other people's trash, shrugged and said it was probably just the sun. The spoon, for its part, offered no opinion. It had already forgotten the hands that had held it, just as they had forgotten it. Chapter 36. The grass closes over. The last visible trace of the village vanished not with a cataclysm, but with a sigh. A particularly wet spring encouraged the meadow grasses to surge over the foundation stones, their roots cradling the rubble like a mother embracing a child she had already forgotten. The oak's fallen trunk rotted into a velvety hummock. The well's stone sank into the mud as if retreating from the sky. Even the paths, those stubborn testaments to foot traffic, at last blurred into the surrounding green. By the time the next surveyor's map was drawn, the valley was marked only as unimproved land, a designation that would have pleased the villagers immensely, had they existed to read it. Chapter 37. The Wind's Epilogue. On a day indistinguishable from any other, the wind paused in its endless wandering to riffle through the valley where the village had once stood. Finding nothing to hold its interest, no laundry to tug at, no chimes to set jingling, not even a leaf to turn inside out, it moved on, its passage noted only by a single dandelion seed spiraling upward on the draft. The seed traveled farther than any villager ever had, crossing rivers and roads and fences that would have intimidated the hardiest of them. Eventually, it came to rest in the cracks of a bustling city square, where it was promptly trampled into oblivion by a procession of clerks, none of whom looked up from their ledgers long enough to notice the sky, the earth, or the spaces in between. Fin ****, Chapter 38, The Geological Sigh. The valley, now indistinguishable from any other patch of unremarkable countryside, continued its slow surrender to geological time, a process so gradual that even the rocks themselves seemed bored by it. Layers of sediment accumulated at a pace that would have tried the patience of a glacier, each stratum a testament to nothing in particular, the particles of former cottages and tools and bones mingling with the detritus of 1,000 indifferent seasons until all distinction was lost. The occasional rainstorm carved shallow rivulets in the earth, their courses meandering with the same lack of purpose that had once characterized the village's daily routines, the water pooling temporarily in depressions that might, to a fanciful observer, have resembled footprints before seeping away into the groundwater, carrying with it the last dissolved traces of iron from nails, calcium from bones, and the faintest molecular echoes of porridge. A landslide in the distant hills deposited a new layer of silt over the eastern field, burying what remained of the disputed fence post under 6 feet of unremarkable dirt, a final and utterly unnecessary punctuation mark to an argument that had never reached a conclusion. The earth's crust, in one of its rare moments of activity, shrugged infinitesimally, raising the valley's elevation by a fraction of an inch over the course of a millennium, a change so negligible that not even the most sensitive of instruments could have attributed it to anything but random chance. The wind, which had once carried the sounds of listless conversation and the occasional yawn, now encountered nothing but the occasional grass stem to flutter, the resulting sound waves dissipating into the atmosphere without so much as an echo to mark their passing. Chapter 39, The Cosmic Indifference. The universe, which had never particularly noticed the village's existence, continued its expansion at a rate that rendered all human concerns, let alone the concerns of those particular humans, mathematically irrelevant. Light from stars that had burned out millennia before the village's founding still reached the valley, their photons expending the last of their energy to illuminate a patch of ground where no one had looked upward in generations. A particularly sensitive spectrometer might, in theory, have detected the faintest spectral signature of wood smoke in the cosmic microwave background, but no such instrument was ever pointed in that direction, and even if it had been, the data would have been lost in the noise of more significant phenomena. The solar system, in its endless orbit around the galactic core, carried the valley through regions of space that had once been supernovae, their radioactive isotopes long since decayed into harmless background particles that mingled with the remnants of the village's carbon atoms in a void so vast that the very concept of mingling became absurd. Quantum fluctuations at the subatomic level occasionally caused particles that had once been part of the village to briefly entangle with particles on the other side of the universe, a phenomenon that would have struck the villagers as deeply significant had they known about it, though in truth it meant nothing at all. The heat death of the universe loomed on a timescale so incomprehensible that even the slowest moving villager would have found it excessive, though by that point every proton in their bodies would have long since decayed into radiation, their very atoms erased from existence as thoroughly as their names had been erased from memory. Chapter 40, The Last Hypothetical. In a timeline that branched away from the main sequence of events at the moment of the village's founding, a divergence so minor it barely qualified as a wrinkle in the fabric of causality, a version of the village persisted into modernity, its inhabitants clinging to their obscurity with a tenacity that defied all demographic trends. The blacksmith's descendants still operated a forge, though they now occasionally repaired bicycle chains for tourists who never returned. The miller's great-great-granddaughter ran an artisanal flour business that lost money every quarter but persisted due to a combination of stubbornness and obtuse tax laws. The oak tree, now a protected landmark, stood in the center of a roundabout that no one used, its roots slowly cracking the asphalt in a silent rebellion against progress. A single graduate student, writing a thesis on post-medieval stasis in rural communities, spent 3 weeks in the village before succumbing to a depressive episode and abandoning academia altogether. The local newsletter, which had been published continuously, if irregularly, for 7 centuries, ran its final edition in 2023. Its lead story a complaint about the new parking restrictions that no one had read, its obituary section blank as it had always been, its crossword puzzle unfinished. The last villager, a woman of indeterminate age who had never learned to operate a smartphone, died in her sleep. One winter night, her passing noted only when the milkman, a holdover from a bygone era, noticed the bottles piling up on her doorstep. The developers who purchased the land the following month found nothing of interest in the soil, no artifacts, no foundations, not even a particularly interesting rock, and proceeded to build a housing estate that would stand half empty for decades, its rooms echoing with the same quiet absence that had characterized the village for its entire existence. In this timeline, as in all others, the story ended not with a bang, not with a whimper, but with the soft, unremarkable sound of a door closing in an empty house, a sound that no one was there to hear. Chapter 41: The Eternal Recurrence. In a universe where time was cyclical rather than linear, a possibility that no villager had ever contemplated, as it would have required thinking about something, the village was destined to reappear at regular intervals, its inhabitants reenacting their lives with the same lack of variation that had characterized the original performance. The same yawns would be yawned, the same porridge stirred, the same debates abandoned mid-thought, all unfolding against the backdrop of a sky that had seen it all before and would see it all again. The cosmic reset button, when pressed, did not so much erase history as smudge it slightly, each iteration of the village differing from the last only in the most trivial of details, a slightly different pattern of moss on the north side of the granary, a marginally more lethargic fly circling the inn's ale barrel, a sigh released a fraction of a second later than in the previous cycle. The villagers, had they been capable of noticing, might have found comfort in the knowledge that their tedium was, in its own way, eternal, a tiny eddy in the great river of time, forever swirling in the same spot, going nowhere, meaning nothing, persisting not out of necessity but simply because no force in the universe could be bothered to dislodge it. But of course, they never did notice, and never would, and so the wheel turned, and the grass grew, and the stars overhead continued their slow march toward oblivion, and it was all exactly the same, and it was all exactly different, and it mattered not at all. Chapter 42: The Unwritten Chapter. There existed, in the spaces between the lines of this history, a chapter that no one would ever read, not because it was hidden, but because it was indistinguishable from the blankness that surrounded it. This chapter contained all the things that had almost happened, the almost love affairs, the almost discoveries, the almost moments of insight that had flickered at the edges of the village's consciousness before dissipating like mist at dawn. It recorded the sigh that had almost been a laugh, the glance that had almost been a recognition, the step that had almost been a journey. It was, in its way, the most truthful chapter of all, for it captured the essence of the village far better than any record of events ever could, not a chronicle of what was, but of what might have been, had anyone cared enough to reach for it. The ink intended for this chapter dried unused in its well, the parchment reserved for it yellowed and crumbled, the words that might have filled it remained unthought, let alone unspoken. And so it sat, empty and perfect, a mirror held up to the void, reflecting nothing, demanding nothing, meaning nothing, a testament, in the end, to the exquisite art of absence. Chapter 43: The Footnote. Here, in the original manuscript, a single drop of wax had fallen from the scribe's candle, obscuring a word that might have been, end, or, and, or possibly nothing of consequence. The stain, when examined under magnification, revealed no hidden meaning, no latent symbolism, just a random accretion of molecules that had, through sheer happenstance, assumed a shape roughly resembling a sheep. Or perhaps a cloud, or nothing at all. Chapter 44: The Unwritten Silence. The blankness that followed was not the blankness of absence, but the blankness of something that had never needed to be present in the first place. It was the blankness of a page that had been deliberately skipped, of a thought that had formed and then dissolved before it could be spoken, of a yawn stifled not out of politeness, but because even the effort of yawning had become too much to sustain. The silence here was not the silence of a held breath, nor the silence of anticipation, nor even the silence of abandonment. It was the silence of a place that had never been loud enough to leave an echo. The wind, had it bothered to blow, would have found nothing to rustle. The rain, had it fallen, would have left no mark on the already damp earth. Time, which had moved sluggishly through the village's existence, now ceased to move at all, not because it had stopped, but because there was no longer any difference between one moment and the next to measure. The universe, vast and indifferent, neither noticed nor cared that this particular patch of ground had returned to the state it had been in before the first hearth was lit, a state of such perfect neutrality that it could not even be called emptiness, for emptiness implies the memory of fullness, and there was no such memory here. Chapter 45, The Erasure. Gradually, though gradually, implies a passage of time that no longer applied. The last physical remnants of the village succumbed to the same apathy that had once characterized its inhabitants. The stones of the well, which had stood longer than any living thing in the valley, finally surrendered to gravity, their collapse so slow and uneventful that not even the earth beneath them registered the impact. The wooden beams of the cottages, already softened by decades of damp, dissolved into a fibrous pulp that even the worms found unappetizing. The rusted blade of the blacksmith's last unfinished project flaked apart into a reddish powder that was indistinguishable from the soil around it. The few pottery shards that had survived the centuries lost their edges to the gentle abrasion of grit and wind, their curves becoming smoother and less distinct with each passing year, if year still had meaning, until they were no longer artifacts at all, but simply slightly denser patches of earth. The valley, which had never been particularly distinctive to begin with, became even less so, its contours softening, its colors fading, its very existence blending into the landscape like a sigh into still air. Chapter 46, The Unmarked Grave. Somewhere beneath what had once been the village green, the bones of the last villager lay in a configuration that might, with imagination, be called a burial. The skeleton was intact, though intact was a generous term for a collection of calcium deposits that had long since begun to crumble back into the earth. The skull, which had once housed thoughts of porridge and the weather and whether the miller's cough would ever improve, now housed only a colony of ants, their tunnels threading through the orbits of the eyes and the gaps between the teeth. They carried no memories with them, these ants, only the instinct to dig, to build, to sustain their own small and meaningless existence. The rest of the bones, the femurs, the ribs, the phalanges, were slowly being absorbed by the roots of a particularly unremarkable weed, its stems thickening imperceptibly with each season as it fed on the minerals left behind. There was no marker to denote the grave, no epitaph to remember the life that had been lived, no offerings left to honor the dead. There was only the slow, inevitable process of decay, proceeding at its own unhurried pace, indifferent to the fact that it was the last act in a play that had never really had an audience. Chapter 47, The Last Light. Above the valley, the stars continued their ancient dance, their light traveling unimpeded through the now unpeopled darkness. The constellations, which the villagers had never bothered to name, shifted imperceptibly over the centuries, their patterns rearranging themselves with glacial slowness. A particularly bright star, one that might, in another time or place, have been wished upon, flared briefly before collapsing into obscurity, its death throes sending a final pulse of radiation across the cosmos. This pulse, weak and diffuse by the time it reached the valley, passed through the empty air where the village had stood, ionizing a few stray molecules of oxygen and nitrogen before continuing on its way, its energy dissipating into the void. No one was there to see it. No one had ever been there to see such things. The light, like the village, like the lives that had been lived there, meant nothing to the universe at large, and the universe, in its infinite coldness, meant nothing back. Chapter 48, The Final Equilibrium. At last, the valley reached a state of perfect equilibrium, not the equilibrium of balance, but the equilibrium of absolute stasis. The temperature of the air matched the temperature of the soil matched the temperature of the rocks, all hovering at the same lukewarm mediocrity that had characterized the village's existence. No forces acted upon the land, for there was nothing left to act upon. No sounds disturbed the silence, for there was nothing left to make noise. No lives were lived or lost, for there was no one left to live or die. The valley simply was, in the way that a stone simply is, or a puddle simply is, or a forgotten word on the tip of a tongue simply is, present, but without significance, without purpose, without history. It was neither a beginning nor an end, neither a memory nor a premonition. It was just a place, like any other place, and then, eventually, not even that. Chapter 49, The Last Word. The last word of this history was not the end, for that would imply there had been a story worth concluding. It was not goodbye, for there had never been a hello. It was not even nothing, for nothing would have been too grand a claim. The last word was, in fact, never written at all. It hovered at the edge of existence, a phantom of a thought, a whisper of a sigh, a half-formed notion that dissolved before it could be grasped. And then even that was gone, and there was only the blank page, and the uncaring sky, and the slow, ceaseless turning of the earth beneath it, carrying the valley and all its unremembered ghosts into a future that would never know their name. Chapter 50, The Dust That Lingered. The dust motes, those final witnesses to what had once been, continued their slow dance in the air currents that no living thing would ever again disturb. Each particle was a perfect microcosm of the village's history, rising briefly when some forgotten draft caught it, hovering in stagnant indecision, then settling back into the cracks between worlds with the same lack of ceremony that had characterized all events in that place. Over decades, or perhaps centuries, time had long since abandoned any pretense of measurement here. Even this dust lost its distinctiveness, its particles separating and dispersing until not even a chemist could have proven they had once been part of a thatched roof, or a woolen tunic, or a child's fingernail. The last identifiable fragment, a single grain of millstone grit, finally came to rest between two blades of grass that had grown through the floorboards of what was never really a house to begin with. There it would remain, not as a memorial, but simply because no force in the universe could be bothered to dislodge it. Chapter 51, The Rain's Epitaph. When the rain fell now, it fell through spaces where walls had once stood, through the ghosts of doorways that had never properly kept out drafts, through the memory of a chimney that had never drawn quite right. The water pooled in depressions that might have been footprints, if anyone had ever walked here with enough force to leave an impression. It soaked into the earth with the same lack of enthusiasm with which the villages had once soaked up sermons, or gossip, or the occasional half-hearted attempt at song. Eventually, even these rainwater pools forgot their original shapes, merging into the groundwater without so much as a sigh. The clouds, having done the duty, moved on to more interesting landscapes where their efforts might actually be noticed. Chapter 52, The Names That Were Never Spoken Again. The syllables that had once been names, Ulrich, Berth, Wolfstan, dissolved into the air like the echoes of yawns in an empty chapel. The particular arrangement of sounds that had signaled, "This person is not that person," lost all meaning, the vibrations of their utterance fading faster than the ripples from a pebble dropped in a forgotten well. The scratch marks on parchment that had represented these names faded to illegibility, then to nothingness, the ink surrendering its pigment molecule by molecule to the relentless patience of time. Even the memory of having had names disappeared, leaving only the vague sense that there must have once been some way to tell one unremarkable life from another, though no one could remember why such a distinction would have mattered. Chapter 53, The Last Suggestion of a Path. For a while, a long while by human standards, but less than an eye blink to the hills, there remained a slight discoloration in the grass where the main path had wound its way between dwellings. The soil, compacted by generations of shuffling feet, resisted the encroachment of roots slightly more than the surrounding earth. An observer might have noticed that the dew evaporated from this line fractionally faster on spring mornings, or that snow melted along its course a few minutes sooner in winter. But there were no observers, and soon enough, though soon is not quite the right word, even this faint tracery vanished, the last physical reminder that anything had ever moved with purpose through this place. The worms, who had never respected human boundaries in the first place, tunneled through the compacted earth without ceremony. Chapter 54. The End of Absence. Eventually, the absence of the village ceased to be an absence at all. It became simply the way things were, the way they had always been. The oak tree that had once been a landmark died quietly and was replaced by another oak, then another, each slightly less distinct than the last. The seasons cycled through their changes without noting that no one was there to complain about the weather. The stars burned and died and were reborn in forms that would never be given names by the tongues that had once occupied this valley. The universe, which had never particularly noticed the village's existence in the first place, continued its expansion into the void, carrying with it the particles that had once formed homes and tools and bones, scattering them so thoroughly that not even the most powerful telescope could have pieced them back together. And in the end, there was no end at all, just the quiet, unremarkable continuation of a world that had never needed stories to begin with. Chapter 55. The Philosophical Implications of a Missing Spoon. Centuries after the last villager had returned to dust, a lone philosopher from a distant city stumbled upon the archaeological report containing that single, unremarkable spoon. He spent 17 years composing a treatise on its metaphysical significance, arguing in increasingly convoluted prose that the spoon represented humanity's futile search for meaning in a fundamentally indifferent universe. His colleagues at the university nodded politely before returning to their own work, none bothering to point out that the spoon had likely been used for nothing more profound than stirring porridge. When the philosopher died mid-sentence during a particularly dense lecture, his students quietly redistributed his notes as scrap parchment. The spoon itself remained in its domestic box, now sharing space with a broken clay pipe and 3 buttons of uncertain provenance. Occasionally, on quiet afternoons when the museum's heating system creaked, one could almost hear the spoon whispering the truth, that it had never meant anything at all, and that this was perhaps the most profound truth of all. Chapter 56. The Geological Yawn. The valley's strata continued accumulating with the same lack of urgency that had characterized all its geological processes. Layer upon layer of sediment deposited itself without enthusiasm, the occasional pebble or bit of organic matter interrupting the monotony of fine-grained silt. Future geologists would classify this period as part of the Great Blandness, notable only for its utter lack of notable features. A single fossilized earthworm, preserved in an unusual moment of activity, became the most exciting discovery from this epoch, a fact that depressed generations of graduate students forced to study it. The worm, had it been capable of opinion, would have been equally unimpressed with the geologists. Chapter 57. The Library of Unread Books. In a parallel universe that differed from our own only in the most trivial details, the shade of moss on north-facing stones was slightly greener. The village idiot had been marginally more articulate. The complete history of the village was recorded in a series of lavishly illuminated manuscripts. These volumes occupied 3 shelves in a forgotten wing of the world's greatest library, where they gathered dust with the same quiet dignity as their subjects had gathered years. Occasionally, a particularly desperate scholar would pull one down, only to find their eyelids growing heavy by the second paragraph. The books remained pristine not out of reverence, but because no one could stay awake long enough to damage them. In this way, they achieved a kind of immortality, not the glorious sort sung of in epics, but the dull, persistent kind exemplified by mildew and administrative bureaucracy. Chapter 58. The Birds That Didn't Sing. Ornithologists would later note the curious absence of songbird fossils in the valley's geological record. This wasn't because the birds hadn't existed, but because their songs had been so half-hearted and unmemorable that even the rocks couldn't be bothered to preserve them. The sparrows had chirped without conviction. The larks had ascended only halfway before losing interest. The cuckoos had kept irregular hours. Their feathers, when occasionally found in archaeological digs, were always muted browns and grays, colors that couldn't decide what mood they were in. The sole exception was a single, brilliantly colored feather that turned out to be from a tropical species blown wildly off course, and which everyone agreed must have been terribly embarrassed to end up there. Chapter 59, The Eternal Reenactment Society. In a small town downstream from the vanished village, a group of enthusiastic amateur historians attempted to recreate daily life as it had been in the settlement. They failed spectacularly by succeeding too well. Their porridge was perfectly bland, their conversations flawlessly banal, the yawns authentically contagious. Within 3 days, the reenactment disbanded due to lack of interest, though no one could remember who had suggested it in the first place. The costumes were repurposed as rags, which somehow made them more interesting than they'd ever been as historical artifacts. Chapter 60, The Final Footnote. Archaeological note. Excavations conducted in the early 22nd century revealed a curious circular depression at the village site. Analysis suggested it might have been the foundation for some sort of structure, possibly a granary or meeting hall. Further study was abandoned when the lead researcher accepted a position studying paint-drying patterns at a more prestigious institution. The hole, left to its own devices, eventually filled with rainwater and became home to a particularly unambitious tadpole. Asterisk. Chapter 61, The Last Light to Go Out. The final light in the universe, billions of years hence, would not be the sun's, nor some distant stars, but the faint glow of bioluminescent bacteria feeding on what remained of the village's organic matter. Even this dim spark would flicker without witness, its photons traveling through an infinite blackness devoid of eyes to see them. The bacteria themselves wouldn't notice when they died, one moment metabolizing, the next not, with no difference between the two states worth mentioning. And with that, the last possible record of the village's existence would vanish, not with a bang or a whimper, but with the soft, indifferent sigh of a universe that had already forgotten. Chapter 62, The Quantum Echo That Wasn't. In the unfathomable vastness of the space-time continuum, where particles flicker in and out of existence with the capriciousness of a candle flame in a drafty hall, there existed, for the briefest measurable instant, a quantum fluctuation that bore an uncanny resemblance to the molecular structure of the village's most mediocre turnip. This anomaly occurred in a distant galaxy, in a star system that would never develop planets capable of supporting life, let alone the particular strain of apathy that had characterized the village's existence. The fluctuation lasted precisely 0.00001 seconds, a duration so insignificant that even the most precise atomic clocks would round it down to zero, during which time it might have, if one squinted metaphorically, constituted a sort of cosmic remembrance of the village. However, as there were no observers present, and even if there had been, they would have quickly lost interest. The fluctuation went unrecorded, its momentary existence serving only to underline the fundamental truth that even in a universe of infinite possibilities, some things simply aren't worth repeating. The particles involved continued on their way, some eventually becoming part of a rather unexceptional nebula, others participating in nuclear reactions that would one day power a star whose planets would never develop civilizations sophisticated enough to ponder the meaninglessness of it all, a fitting continuation of the legacy, had anyone been around to appreciate the irony. Chapter 63, The Thermodynamic Aftermath. The heat death of the universe, when it finally arrived after countless eons of gradual entropic decay, found the former site of the village in a state that was, against all statistical odds, indistinguishable from its condition during the settlement's heyday. The temperature throughout the cosmos had equalized to a tepid uniformity that would have felt familiar to anyone who had ever spent a summer afternoon in the village square, where the air hung motionless and unremarkable. All energy gradients that might have driven changer activity had long since dissipated, leaving behind only the faintest quantum vibrations, particles shifting in their eternal rest with the same lack of purpose that the villages had once shifted from foot to foot while waiting for nothing in particular. The atoms that had once comprised the millstones, the cooking pots, the thatched roofs, and the bones of the inhabitants were now scattered so evenly across the void that not even a hypothetical omnipotent being could have reassembled them, not that any such being would have bothered. The great irony, of course, was that the universe's final state of perfect equilibrium mirrored the village's own enduring achievement, a profound, unbroken sameness that neither asked for nor permitted meaning. Answer: at last, the cosmos achieved what the villages had always known instinctively, that in the grand scheme of things, nothing really matters, and that the closest thing to eternity is simply persisting without purpose until even persistence becomes irrelevant. Chapter 64. The indifferent erosion of meaning. The wind, if one could call it that, moved across the flattened expanse where the village had once stood with all the enthusiasm of a sigh trapped in an endless loop. It was not a wind that carried stories or whispered secrets. It was the kind of wind that had forgotten why it was blowing in the first place, listlessly pushing a few dust particles in circles before giving up entirely. The dust, for its part, had long since ceased to remember whether it had once been part of a thatched roof, a worn-out shoe, or the crumbled remains of the miller's third-best grinding stone. It simply existed, drifting when nudged, settling when ignored, and occasionally clinging to the stem of a weed that had grown where old Martyr's cottage had once sagged into the earth. The weed, a particularly unremarkable specimen of a common species, did not even have the decency to wilt dramatically. It just stood there, barely photosynthesizing, as if even the basic functions of life were too much effort. Chapter 65. The uncelebrated anniversary. Had anyone been keeping track, and they weren't, it might have been the 1000th anniversary of the day the last villager had died. Or perhaps the 10,000th. Or maybe just another Tuesday. Time had long since ceased to be measured in any meaningful way, and the concept of anniversaries had dissolved into the same void that had swallowed the names of the villages, their petty disputes, and the exact recipe for the porridge that had sustained, if one could call it that, generations. The sun rose and set with the same monotonous regularity it always had, casting shadows that no longer fell across fences, graves, or the stubbornly crooked door of the blacksmith's shop. The shadows simply pulled on the ground, formless and unclaimed, until the light shifted and they slithered away to nowhere in particular. Chapter 66. The last artifact that nobody found. Beneath what had once been the floorboards of the alehouse, though alehouse was too grand a term for a building that had served mostly lukewarm disappointment in ceramic mugs, a single button lay buried in the dirt. It was plain, unpolished, and slightly uneven, as if the person who had made it had lost interest halfway through. Over the centuries, the button had slowly sunk deeper into the soil, nudged along by worms that couldn't be bothered to eat it and the occasional trickle of rainwater that lacked the energy to wash it away. By the time the earth around it had compressed into stone, the button was trapped in a darkness so complete that not even the most determined archaeologist with the finest tools would have thought to look for it. Not that any did. The button, unaware of its own irrelevance, continued to exist in perfect obscurity, its one hole staring blankly at nothing for all eternity. Chapter 67. The tree that almost grew. In the spot where the village's lone oak had once stood, before it succumbed to a combination of rot, indifference, and a particularly lazy lightning strike, a sapling had attempted to take root. It was a valiant effort, or at least it would have been if anyone had been watching. The sapling stretched its roots toward the thin, exhausted soil, pushed its leaves toward the grayish sunlight, and generally did everything a young tree was supposed to do. But the legacy of the village clung to the land like a stubborn stain, and the sapling, sensing the overwhelming aura of apathy, eventually gave up. It didn't die dramatically, toppling in a storm or withering from drought. It just stopped trying. Its leaves yellowed without fanfare, its trunk softened without protest, and by the time the next winter rolled around, it had melted back into the earth as quietly as a sigh dissolving into a damp afternoon. Chapter 68. The sound that wasn't heard. On a day indistinguishable from any other, which is to say, a day that was neither memorable nor forgettable because no one was there to remember or forget it, a single sound occurred where the village had been. It was not the creak of a door, the murmur of conversation, or the half-hearted clang of the blacksmith's hammer. It was the sound of a single pebble, dislodged by nothing in particular, rolling down the slight incline where the well had once stood. The pebble bounced once, twice, then came to rest in a shallow depression that might, in another time, have been called a footprint. The sound it made was soft, dull, and utterly unremarkable. It did not echo. It did not signal anything. It was not a metaphor. It was just a pebble, landing where no one would ever hear it, in a place that had long since ceased to care. Chapter 69. The end that wasn't an ending. And so it went. And so it didn't. The universe expanded, stars burned out, and the molecules that had once been part of the village scattered so thinly across existence that not even the most sensitive instruments could have traced them. The great irony, of course, was that the village had never really ended, because to end would imply it had once had a meaningful beginning. It had simply faded, like a stain slowly disappearing from an old shirt, like a name whispered once and then forgotten, like the last flicker of a candle that had never been all that bright to begin with. And if, by some impossible chance, a being from another world were to stumble upon the place where the village had been, they would find nothing to remark upon. No monuments, no ruins, no lingering ghosts. Just the quiet, unbroken sameness of a world that had always been, and would always be, profoundly and unremarkably indifferent. Chapter 70. The pebble that refused to be interesting. The pebble mentioned in Chapter 68, the one that had rolled down the former well's incline with such underwhelming acoustics, continued its existence with the same lack of distinction that had characterized everything else in the village's history. Over the next several millennia, though, several millennia, implies a level of chronological precision that the universe had long since abandoned in this particular locale, the pebble underwent a series of changes so incremental they couldn't properly be called erosion. A single layer of molecules sloughed off its underside every 27 years, not due to weathering but because even atomic bonds grew weary of maintaining their structure in this place. By the time the last glacier passed through the region, a glacier that was, in keeping with local tradition, neither impressively large nor remarkably slow, the pebble had been reduced to a grain of sand indistinguishable from any other grain of sand, except that this particular grain carried within its crystalline structure a perfect memory of being profoundly unexceptional. Chapter 71. The soil's half-hearted rebellion. At one point, though, point, suggests a temporal specificity that the narrative can no longer sustain, the soil where the village square had been attempted to develop a unique mineral signature. This wasn't out of any desire to be special, but rather because the laws of chemistry demanded some variation in local composition. The attempt failed when the minerals realized they'd have to organize themselves into something recognizable as a pattern, and patterns required effort. Instead, the soil settled into a composition best described as vaguely earthy, with trace elements that might have been pottery shards or might have been unusually dense dirt no one could be bothered to investigate. When a particularly heavy rain finally washed the last of the distinctive, though not too distinctive, minerals downstream, the event went unmarked except by a single earthworm that paused in its meandering to consider whether anything had changed, decided it hadn't, and continued tunneling in a direction that wasn't quite horizontal but couldn't be bothered to become vertical. Chapter 72. The microclimate of mild disappointment. Meteorological records, had anyone been keeping them, would have shown that the village's former location developed a microclimate slightly more humid than the surrounding area, but less humid than anywhere interesting. This phenomenon wasn't due to any lingering spiritual presence or geological oddity, but rather because the air currents in this particular valley had always moved with the enthusiasm of a teenager asked to do chores. The extra humidity came from the collective sigh of relief the land exhaled once human occupation ceased, though, sigh, implies an emotional content the landscape was fundamentally incapable of experiencing. The moisture gathered just enough to form the occasional fog bank, but never enough to inspire comparisons to more photographically appealing locales like moors or rainforests. When climate change eventually reshaped the region's weather patterns centuries later, this patch of ground was the last to receive the memo, and even then only in the form of a lightly dampened post-it note stuck to the cosmic refrigerator and immediately ignored. Chapter 73. The Subatomic Legacy. Quantum physicists, who obviously never studied this specific location because why would they, might have been mildly interested to know that the atoms comprising the village's material remains maintained a peculiar tendency toward ennui. Electrons orbited nuclei with just slightly less energy than required for excitement. Quarks paired off with the bare minimum of charm. Even the virtual particles popping in and out of existence did so with noticeably less verve than their counterparts elsewhere in the universe. This wasn't so much a physical law as it was a habit the local quantum fields had fallen into, like a couch that still bears the faint impression of someone who hasn't sat there in years. When the heat death of the universe finally arrived and all molecular motion ceased, these particular atoms stopped moving a full picosecond before the rest, not out of any philosophical preference for stillness, but because they'd been practicing for eons. Chapter 74. The Epilogue That Wasn't. Some stories end with moral lessons. Some with poetic resonance. Some with dramatic twists that reframe all that came before. This story, if one could call the gradual accumulation of vaguely connected sentences a story, ended as it had begun, without fanfare, without meaning, and without the slightest indication that anyone or anything had ever cared. The words on the page, or screen, depending on how one encountered this text, dissolved into the white space around them, the letters losing their cohesion like the village's names slipping from memory. And if you, dear reader, though dear, may be overstating our relationship, find yourself still waiting for some revelation or conclusion, consider this. The greatest tribute to the village's legacy isn't in the telling, but in the forgetting. Chapter 75. The Eternal Monotony of Geological Time. The sedimentary layers accumulating over the former village site developed a peculiar characteristic that would have fascinated any geologist unfortunate enough to study them. Each stratum was almost, but not quite, identical to the one beneath it. The variations were so minute as to be nearly undetectable. A 0.03% decrease in feldspar content here, a barely measurable increase in iron oxide there. These changes occurred with such excruciating slowness that the very concept of change became meaningless. A single pebble might take 15,000 years to travel 3 inches downstream in the sluggish creek that had once watered the village's pathetic vegetable plots. The creek itself couldn't be bothered to properly erode its banks, instead meandering in half-hearted loops that created oxbows so lazy they made regular oxbows look like Olympic sprinters by comparison. Fossilization occurred at rates so glacial that a dead field mouse from the village's heyday was still only approximately 12% mineralized some 8,000 years later, its tiny bones suspended in a state of semi-decay that perfectly mirrored the village's own historical trajectory, neither properly preserved nor completely gone, just stuck in the geological equivalent of a waiting room with outdated magazines. Chapter 76. The Microorganisms That Inherited the Boredom. The microbial communities thriving in the village's topsoil developed metabolic processes so inefficient they defied evolutionary logic. Certain strains of bacteria replicated only during leap years, their cellular division inhibited by what scientists would later term existential drag. Fungal networks grew in fractal patterns that started out promisingly complex before devolving into lackluster squiggles, like a doodle abandoned midway through a particularly dull lecture. The most successful organism was a novel extremophile species that thrived on minimal energy inputs by essentially doing nothing at all for decades at a time, a survival strategy that would have made the villagers proud had they possessed the biological sophistication to understand it. When researchers eventually discovered this microbial ecosystem while searching for something more interesting nearby, their peer-reviewed paper received exactly one citation before being forgotten by the scientific community. a fitting tribute to the legacy of the place that had birthed these supremely unambitious lifeforms. Chapter 77. The atmospheric anomaly of perpetual dullness. Weather systems passing over the former village site exhibited behavioral oddities that frustrated meteorologists. Fronts slowed to half the normal velocity, as if the air itself had absorbed the torpor of centuries. Cloud formations developed a peculiar flatness, their shadows falling across the landscape with all the dramatic effect of a theater spotlight illuminating an empty stage. Even extreme weather events lost their vigor when crossing this cursed geography. Tornadoes downgraded to mild breezes, thunderstorms reduced to half-hearted drizzle, heatwaves that couldn't quite muster the energy to exceed 78 degrees Fahrenheit. The phenomenon became known in meteorological circles as the bland spot, though no formal studies were ever conducted because every research team assigned to investigate either fell asleep or found excuses to study more exciting weather phenomena elsewhere. Satellite imagery revealed that the area reflected sunlight in a color spectrum officially classified as beige-gray number 473b on the Pantone dullness scale, a shade previously thought to exist only in theoretical models and Department of Motor Vehicles waiting areas. Chapter 78. The archaeological dig that almost happened. In 2147, an overeager graduate student named Edwin Plinth identified the village site as a potential location for his dissertation on post-medieval subsistence strategies in marginal communities. His initial survey revealed such profoundly unremarkable findings that his advisory committee wept openly during his proposal defense, not from emotion, but from sheer psychic exhaustion. The single trench his team excavated yielded artifacts of such stunning banality: a rusted hinge of indeterminate age, 37 nearly identical pottery shards, what might have been a button or possibly just an interestingly shaped pebble that the field notes essentially wrote themselves in increasingly despondent shorthand, layer 4, more dirt. Possibly slightly darker dirt, might be wrong. When funding was abruptly redirected to study a nearby Neolithic midden heap that at least contained some interesting animal bones, Plinth abandoned archaeology altogether and took a lucrative position auditing spreadsheet data, a career change everyone agreed suited his talents far better. The excavation site filled back in with soil at approximately the same rate it had been dug, as if the earth itself couldn't be bothered to maintain the pretense of archaeological significance. Chapter 79. The Quantum Physics of Unremarkableness. String theorists eventually determined that the village occupied, or rather, failed to occupy, a peculiar nexus in the space-time continuum where the fundamental forces of the universe operated at 3.7% reduced efficiency. Gravity was slightly weaker here, not enough to notice, but enough that dropped objects fell with just perceptibly less enthusiasm. Electromagnetic attraction between molecules lacked its usual vigor, explaining why nothing in the village ever properly stuck together. Even the strong nuclear force seemed to phone it in, resulting in atomic structures that were technically stable but somehow conveyed an air of indifference about the whole arrangement. This discovery led to the short-lived field of apathetic physics, which sought to understand why some regions of spacetime simply couldn't be bothered to adhere to normal physical laws with any real conviction. The research collapsed under its own inertia when no one could muster the energy to write up the findings for publication, though some believe the unpublished data may still exist in a filing cabinet in Zurich, slowly fossilizing into a perfect metaphor for academic obscurity. Chapter 80. The Last Photon's Journey. In the unimaginably distant future, when the accelerating expansion of the universe has stretched spacetime beyond all recognition, the very last photon emitted from the village's final dying ember, not that anyone had been around to witness it, will continue its lonely voyage through the infinite void. This photon, already ancient when the pyramids were young, carries no meaningful information, no profound message from the past. Its wavelength, redshifted beyond all measurement, tells no stories of human endeavor or natural wonder. It is, in every sense, the perfect emissary for the place that birthed it, unremarkable, undemanding, and utterly devoid of the energy required to make an impact on anything it encounters. When the cosmos finally achieves maximum entropy and even this last photon winks out of existence, the transition will be so subtle, so insignificant, that not even the universe itself will notice the difference. And so the story ends as it began, not with a bang, not with a whimper, but with the quiet, unobserved dissolution of something that was never truly there to begin with. Chapter 81. The perpetual aftermath of absolute nothingness. The void left behind by the village's disappearance was not the dramatic, echoing chasm of more historically significant extinctions, but rather a damp, lukewarm nothingness that failed to even properly qualify as an absence. It was the metaphysical equivalent of a water stain on a cheap desk, present enough to be vaguely annoying, but not significant enough to ever properly clean. Centuries oozed past like cold porridge sliding off a spoon, each decade indistinguishable from the last, the very air. Growing thicker with the accumulated weight of unremarkable moments piling up like unread administrative memos in the cosmic bureaucracy. The few surviving microorganisms that had somehow inherited the village's genetic predisposition to mediocrity continued dividing at rates so sluggish they made continental drift seem positively hasty by comparison, their cellular processes operating with all the enthusiasm of a clerk processing paperwork at the end of a 15-hour shift. Even the laws of physics seemed to bend here, not in the dramatic way that might create wormholes or time paradoxes, but in the manner that caused light to move slightly slower through this particular patch of atmosphere, as if the photons themselves were dragging their feet about having to illuminate such profoundly uninteresting ground. Chapter 82. The soil's half-hearted attempt at meaning. The dirt, because it would be too generous to call it soil, where the village once stood developed a peculiar chemical composition that agricultural specialists would later describe as aggressively average. Its pH hovered at precisely 7.0, its nutrient profile was adequate without ever being sufficient, and its texture existed in the exact midpoint between sandy and clay-like, achieving a perfect equilibrium of underwhelming growing potential. When modern farmers attempted to cultivate this land centuries later, their crops grew with just enough vitality to avoid outright failure while simultaneously failing to produce anything worth harvesting. Wheat stalks reached exactly 23.7 inches tall before losing interest and bending over slightly. Carrots developed to the size and shape of thumbs before deciding that further growth was too much effort. Potatoes emerged from the earth looking vaguely embarrassed by their own lumpy inadequacy. The single apple tree that managed to take root bore fruit so devoid of flavor that local children used them as projectiles in a game called Who Can Care the Least, where the winner was whichever player first wandered away mid-game to take a nap behind the barn. Chapter 83. The Climate of Eternal Mare. Meteorological records, had anyone bothered to keep them, would have shown that the village's former location existed in a perpetual state of mild weather conditions. Temperatures fluctuated between 12 degrees Celsius and 17 degrees Celsius year-round, with precipitation occurring exactly 1.3 days per week in amounts so precisely average they defied statistical probability. The barometric pressure never spiked or plummeted, but rather hovered at 1013.25 hectopascals with the monotonous consistency of a metronome set to the world's slowest tempo. Wind patterns moved in listless circles, like a bored office worker spinning idly in their chair, never gaining enough momentum to properly qualify as a breeze but never quite settling into complete stillness either. The most extreme weather event ever recorded was a light mist that lingered for approximately 37 hours before dissipating without fanfare, an occurrence so forgettable that even the worms failed to alter their behavior in response. Chapter 84. The Archaeological Non-Discovery. When a team of underfunded archaeologists finally excavated the site in 2371, their findings were so underwhelming that their final report consisted of just 3 words, "Nothing of note," followed by 400 blank pages that the lead researcher insisted were artistic commentary on the void of meaning in post-industrial historiography, but which everyone knew was just padding to meet the university's minimum page requirement. The single most interesting artifact uncovered, a rusted iron nail bent at a 13-degree angle, spent 3 decades in a storage locker before being accidentally thrown out during an office cleaning. The graduate student who had written her dissertation on this nail never noticed its disappearance, having long since abandoned academia to raise alpacas in a region with marginally more interesting topography. Chapter 85. The Quantum Physics of Unremarkableness. Advanced particle physics eventually revealed that the village occupied, or more accurately, failed to occupy, a peculiar nexus in the space-time continuum where the fundamental forces of the universe operated at exactly 7.2% reduced efficiency. Gravity was slightly weaker here, not enough to be noticeable, but enough that dropped objects fell with just perceptibly less enthusiasm. Electromagnetic attraction between molecules lacked its usual vigor, explaining why nothing in the village ever properly stuck together. Even the strong nuclear force seemed to half-ass its job here, resulting in atomic structures that were technically stable but somehow conveyed an air of indifference about the whole arrangement. This discovery led to the short-lived field of apathetic physics, which collapsed under its own inertia when researchers realized that even the groundbreaking revelations in their field weren't quite groundbreaking enough to justify the effort of publishing papers. Chapter 86. The Legacy of Uninfluence. The village's complete lack of cultural, historical, or genetic impact became, ironically, the subject of numerous academic studies examining how a human settlement could exist for centuries without producing a single noteworthy idea, person, or artifact. Sociologists developed complex models proving it was statistically impossible for a community to be this consistently unremarkable, while mathematicians calculated the exact probability of such profound mediocrity occurring naturally, approximately 1 in 7.5 billion, or roughly the same odds as winning the lottery and then immediately misplacing the ticket. Philosophers debated whether the village's existence, or more accurately, its non-existence, proved or disproved various ontological theories, until they realized they were just going in circles and decided to take up gardening instead. Chapter 87. The End That Wasn't Even Worth Capitalizing. Answer the story, if one could call it that, winds down not with a climax or revelation, but with the slow, inevitable fading of all things into uniform grayness. The last photon emitted from the village's final dying ember, not that anyone was around to witness it, continues its journey through an expanding universe, its wavelength stretching into infinity, carrying with it no stories, no wisdom, no meaning, just the faint thermal signature of something that was never quite warm enough to begin with. The atoms that once comprised homes and tools and bones have long since scattered across light years of empty space, their trajectories as random and purposeless as the lives they once briefly constituted. And if, against all cosmic odds, some intelligence should someday encounter these atoms and attempt to reconstruct their origin, they will find nothing to spark their curiosity, no mystery worth solving, no lesson worth learning, just the quiet, unobserved dissolution of something that was never truly there to begin with. Chapter 88. The Eternal Recurrence of Unremarkable Events. The cyclical nature of time, if one subscribes to such cosmological theories, suggests that all possible configurations of matter and energy will eventually repeat themselves. In this grand cosmic return, the village, or something indistinguishable from it in all meaningful characteristics, will inevitably reconstitute itself down to the last detail, the same crooked fence posts leaning at precisely 12.7 degrees from vertical, the same perpetually under-seasoned stew simmering over hearths that never quite achieved optimal cooking temperatures, the same half-hearted greetings exchanged between residents who couldn't muster the energy for proper salutations but felt vaguely guilty about complete silence. This recurrence differs from Nietzsche's eternal return in one crucial aspect, where the philosopher imagined the most triumphant moments of existence being endlessly relived. This particular cycle ensures only the most mediocre, forgettable instants repeat themselves with atomic precision. The villagers will blink the same listless blinks, sigh the same resigned sighs, and stir their porridge with the same lack of enthusiasm in perpetuity, their existence serving as the universe's most potent counter-argument to the notion that all events must have meaning simply by virtue of having occurred. Chapter 89. The Geological Record of Unimportance. Sedimentary layers accumulating over the former village site developed a peculiar characteristic that frustrated generations of geologists, Each stratum was almost, but not quite, identical to the one beneath it. The variations were so minute as to require electron microscopy to detect a 0.0003% decrease in quartz content here, a barely measurable shift in loam particle distribution there. These changes occurred with such excruciating slowness that the very concept of geological time seemed impatient by comparison. A single pebble might take 23,000 years to travel 4 inches downstream in the lethargic creek that had once watered the village's anemic vegetable patches. Fossilization occurred at rates so glacial that a dead field mouse from the settlement's peak population period remained only 8% mineralized after 12 millennia, its tiny bones suspended in a state of semi-decay that perfectly mirrored the village's own historical trajectory, neither properly preserved nor completely gone, just existing in the lithic equivalent of a waiting room with nothing to read. When a particularly ambitious graduate student attempted to write her dissertation on this geological torpor, her committee members developed stress-related alopecia from the sheer tedium of reviewing her findings. Chapter 90. The quantum fluctuation of indifference. At the subatomic level, particles in the village's former location exhibited behavior that baffled physicists. Electrons orbited nuclei with just slightly less energy than quantum models predicted, as if the very laws of physics couldn't be bothered to enforce themselves properly in this backwater of space-time. Virtual particle pairs appeared and annihilated with noticeable reluctance, their brief existence marked by what one researcher described as quantum-level sighing. The strong nuclear force, that mighty cosmic glue binding atomic nuclei together, operated at 96.4% standard efficiency in this region, resulting in matter that was technically stable but somehow conveyed an air of apathy about the whole arrangement. This discovery led to the short-lived field of apathetic quantum mechanics, which collapsed when researchers realized the groundbreaking findings about universal mediocrity weren't quite groundbreaking enough to justify continued funding. The sole remaining artifact of this academic pursuit is a single PowerPoint slide buried in an abandoned university server, its bullet points gradually fading into digital entropy. Chapter 91. The meteorological phenomenon of perpetual mildness. Weather systems passing through the region exhibited behavioral anomalies that defied conventional climatology. Fronts slowed to 1/3 the normal velocity, as if the air itself had absorbed the torpor of centuries. Cloud formations developed a peculiar flatness, their shadows falling across the landscape with all the dramatic effect of a flashlight shining through tissue paper. Even extreme weather events lost their vigor when crossing this geographical oddity. Tornadoes downgraded to mild breezes, thunderstorms reduced to half-hearted drizzle, heat waves that couldn't quite muster the energy to exceed 81 degrees Fahrenheit. The phenomenon became known in meteorological circles as the bland spot, though no formal studies were ever completed because every research team assigned to investigate either fell asleep or found excuses to study more interesting weather elsewhere. Satellite imagery revealed the area reflected sunlight in a color spectrum officially classified as beige-gray number 473b on the Pantone dullness scale, a shade previously thought to exist only in theoretical models and mid-tier rental car interiors. Chapter 92. The archaeological non-event of 2547. When the University of North Wessex's Archaeology Department finally excavated the site in 2547, their findings were so underwhelming that their final report consisted of just 2 words, mostly dirt, followed by 600 pages of intentionally blurred photographs and margin doodles of frowny faces. The single most interesting artifact uncovered, a rusted iron nail bent at a 17-degree angle, spent 5 decades in a storage locker before being accidentally recycled during an office reorganization. The graduate student who had based his entire thesis on this nail never noticed its disappearance, having quietly abandoned academia to pursue a career in mattress testing. Subsequent digs uncovered layers of settlements so devoid of distinguishing characteristics that stratigraphic dating became impossible. Each era's remains were equally unremarkable, creating an archaeological record as flat and featureless as the village's emotional lives. Chapter 93. The biological legacy of minimal adaptation. The local ecosystem gradually reclaimed the village site with all the enthusiasm of a teenager doing chores. Trees grew where cottages once stood, but the growth rings showed a peculiar pattern of half-hearted development, years where the tree couldn't be bothered to add more than a few cell layers. Birds nested in the area but consistently laid one fewer egg than their species typically produced elsewhere. Even the earthworms moved through the soil with noticeably less vigor, their casts forming miniature towers that always collapsed before reaching impressive heights. The most successful organism was a novel lichen species that thrived by essentially doing nothing at all for decades at a time, a survival strategy that would have made the villagers proud had they possessed the biological sophistication to understand it. When researchers discovered this extremophile species while searching for something more interesting nearby, their peer-reviewed paper received exactly one citation before being forgotten by the scientific community, a fitting tribute to the legacy of the place that had birthed these supremely unambitious lifeforms. Chapter 94. The Cosmic Perspective on Insignificance. From the viewpoint of a hypothetical observer orbiting Betelgeuse, the village's entire existence, from its founding to its disappearance to its eventual geological subsumption, would register as less significant than the thermal fluctuation from a single dying photon in the cosmic microwave background. The gravitational waves generated by its most energetic event, the Great Mead Barrel Collapse of 1342, which claimed half a gallon of Sapar ale, were orders of magnitude weaker than those produced by a dust mote falling on a neutron star. Even the theoretical heat death of the universe would scarcely notice the transition when the last subatomic particles derived from the village's material remains finally ceased their motion, those particular quarks and leptons having spent the preceding eons moving with noticeably less enthusiasm than their counterparts elsewhere in the cosmos. Chapter 95. The final end, no really this time, ****. And so we arrive, through countless pages of meticulously documented tedium, at the ultimate conclusion that there was never really a beginning worth noting in the first place. The atoms that briefly arranged themselves into something resembling a village have now dispersed across light years of interstellar space, their trajectories as random and purposeless as the lives they once constituted. The last photon bearing any trace of the settlement's thermal signature now redshifts into oblivion, carrying no stories, no wisdom, no meaning, just the faint aftertaste of something that was never particularly noteworthy to begin with. The universe continues its expansion, utterly indifferent to this minor and quickly forgotten fluctuation in localized entropy. Galaxies form, stars ignite and die, civilizations rise and fall, and nowhere in this grand cosmic pageant is there even the faintest echo of a place that mastered the art of being forgotten before it had even properly existed.